Environmental changes to the Earth during the last ice age led to the migration of people from Asia to the Americas. The different regions that these people would eventually inhabit had different environments, and the people adapted to these environments. The environment affected the food, clothing, shelter, migration, and language of these early Americans. They relied on the environment and its resources for all aspects of their lives. The environment affected the food that the early Americans ate. Groups like the Inuit that inhabited areas around the sea relied on fish for food. Other groups like the Iroquois and Cherokee developed the ability to raise simple crops because the soil was conducive to this activity. Other groups like the Sioux were hunters and followed food from place to place because the animals roamed the land. The food of early Americans were dependent upon the environment they lived in. The environment also affected the clothes that the early Americans wore. They made clothing out of resources that were available to them. The Inuit made clothing out of sealskin because that was a resource available to them. The sealskin protected them from the environment and helped to keep them warm. The Iroquois hunted animals like deer and made clothes from these animals. Most of the early Americans made their clothing out of animal hides. This is a good use of the resources available to them in the environment because if the hides keep the animals warm, it would help to keep the humans warm. The environment also affected the shelters that the early Americans constructed. They would create shelter with the resources in their environment. The Inuit would create temporary shelters on hunts called igloos, and these were made of snow. Their more permanent homes were made of sod and mud. The Iroquois created longhouses made of wood because they had an abundance of trees in the areas they inhabited. The Sioux would create teepees because they were nomadic. They could be more easily moved to go with the Sioux as they would move from place to place. Teepees were made of animal hides and branches. These groups created shelters from the resources available to them in their environment. The environment also affected the migration of the early Americans. The Sioux were nomadic. This means they would move around on a regular basis. They did this because they were following big animals to hunt. Their food source moved, so they moved. Their environment did not permanently provide all the food they needed, so they would change to an environment that would. The environment also affected the language that the early Americans developed and used. Words were used by early Americans to communicate with each other. The more abundant of a resource, the more words they had to describe that resource. An example of this would be that the Inuit would have more words to describe snow than the Cherokee.